From the 2016 National Volunteering Conference, Canberra, you're listening to a series of podcasts powered by Pop-Up Radio Australia.
Anne's come all the way from Western Australia, and she's from the Murdoch University School of Management and Governance. And she's been a lecturer and tutor at Murdoch University since 1997 in the School of Management and Governance. She's currently undertaking a PhD examining advocacy in non-profit organisations and the relationship they have with governments, often their primary funder. Anne is about to talk on advocacy by Australian non-profit organisations, risks and responsibilities, tactics and tensions. Please make Anne welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to give my presentation today. Now, I come from Perth. Perth's not that far away. It was just one flight, so it's okay. Today, my presentation is reporting on some of the aspects I've found in my PhD study. For the last probably 6 or 7 years, I've been working in and around not-for-profits from a research perspective. So, as an academic, I'll be presenting my data on what I have found in how not-for-profits deal with this issue of advocacy. And an interesting element I've found within that is how they are using their volunteer resources to advocate on behalf of their causes. So it's been interesting looking at how they deal with this and the different ways that they engage volunteers in their advocacy. So I'm going to be presenting the findings from the 4 case studies I've done on 4 organisations in WA. Okay. Just a little bit of background about not-for-profits, and you're probably already aware of a lot of these anyway because you're working in and around them all the time. But just some general theory on it. Not-for-profits are what we call non-profit distributing. It doesn't mean they don't make a profit, but whatever profit they make gets reinvested in the organisation. So they're not distributing to shareholders or anyone else. They're institutionally separate from government and generally from private organisations. So they have their own legal or social entity, and they are self-governing. So a lot of the organisations you will work with, you'll have your own boards, you'll have CEOs, you'll have a management structure which organise the organisation. Not-for-profits are generally formed for the purpose of producing some form of goods or services to the community that they are there for. We call them lots of different things. For those of you who were just in the presentation that David Locke gave from the ACNC, he refers to them as charities. So charities is just one group of not-for-profits. We might refer to them as the third sector industry as well, voluntary sector, the social economy, community sector, the civil society organisation. So they have a lot of different labels, which we know them in the community. Okay, where are they? They are everywhere. So, I mean, you already know where they exist, but they're in all parts of the community. The areas I've been looking at are specifically in health. So the organisations I've been running my data surveys through are in the health sector. These are the categories set out by the United Nations, and so this is generally the reporting structure that we use when we're dealing with these organisations. Within each one of these categories, the non-profit organisations also have diverse organisational forms and structures. Some are small, some are large, some have paid employees, some don't. So they are very, very different. Sometimes these trends can make it difficult to compare across the different sections, but I think generally there are some traits that can be compared. Funding. David also talked in the last presentation about funding, and thankfully my figures agree with his, but funding comes from a multiple range of sources. Governments have recognised that non-profit organisations serve a really important role in providing services and resources in the community, often services that wouldn't have been provided by government or private sector. So we do have quite a diverse range of services in a different style and different types. And as a consequence, they're going to find their funding from different sources as well. So you can see here we've got government, foundation grants, donations, bequests, memberships, philanthropy, social investment bonds and social enterprises. Fundraising is also quite a strong area as well. In some ways that some of these groups are diversifying is through commercial and business operations. So they're looking to diversify their funding portfolio. In the ABS data, 38.1% of funding was from government sources, and this parallels with what David found with the ACNC reporting as well. So quite a reasonable amount of the funding does come from governments. And this is where the dilemma starts. If you're getting your funding from one particular source and you want them to make a change in policy or regulation, how do you negotiate that relationship? Employment. This morning, Tim and Robert spoke about the importance of volunteers and the significant contribution that volunteers make, not just from the services they will deliver, but also from an economic point of view as well. So again, looking at the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, Australian non-profit organisations employed over 1 million persons and also 3.9 million volunteers. Okay, so that's quite a significant amount. So this is just in 2012, 2013 data. The value of volunteers to the not-for-profit sector is in 521 million hours at a value of $17.3 billion. So that is really quite significant. What do non-profits do? Generally, they deliver goods and services. So they're out there in the community delivering these goods and services in a space where, as I said before, not often do governments or private organisations identify those areas that they want to work in. And that could be for lots of different reasons. Maybe it's a policy decision and maybe it's a profit-making decision. So not-for-profits fill that space. They have a significant role in the community, not only by delivering these goods and services, but in the difference they can make. And this is where we talk about this issue of social capital. They provide a service to the community through their education. They can voice to the community or to the public and to governments issues that the community are concerned about. They strengthen democracy and they have an opportunity to be involved in the policy process. So that becomes quite significant. And at times they act as watchdogs. Non-profits generally will serve as part of the community that may not necessarily have access to the goods and services or to a voice that other areas of the community have. So non-profits provide that conduit for these particular individuals. One of the issues that have come out with the research, and this has also come in the literature, is that not all not-for-profits are able to hold a position in the community as far as advocating for their clients. They may be limited by resources and by skills. So this is another issue when we're talking about the number of communities, the number of not-for-profits that are small. How do they voice this particular role for them? Okay, got a little picture, because pictures can help sometimes. So this is just a little picture to identify the relationship between not-for-profits, governments and the community. So with not-for-profits, they're generally servicing a community that in some ways may be marginalised or disadvantaged and don't have access to the normal resources. So not-for-profits can provide those resources. So they will provide the goods and services, there we go, that this particular community require. Government don't always get involved, but they do recognise that this particular area of the community needs to be serviced. So they will provide the funding for the not-for-profit to deliver these goods and services. The not-for-profit, they're the ones out there doing the work, so they know what's happening in the community. So sometimes they have to go back to the government and say, okay, thank you for the money, but we have a problem. And this is where this advocacy comes into it. How do they negotiate changes to policy or legislation where they're asking on one hand, please give me money, and on the other hand they're going, actually we want something back and you may not like what we say. The other important aspect that not-for-profits provide is social capital. They, as I said before, are the conduit between the marginalised cohort and the community. They provide information, they provide access to source resources and services that these individuals may not necessarily have. So, as you're all aware anyway, not-for-profits are incredibly important. So we're going to look at this issue of advocacy. How are the organisations out there negotiating this what they call delicate dance with governments? Okay. Being an academic, I do a lot of research in literature, so I've gone through a lot of the definitions of what advocacy may or may not be. So I've just come down with a couple that I just wanted to talk about. So what is advocacy? Active interventions by organisations on behalf of the collective interests they represent that have the goal of influencing public policy, or to advance the interest of a group by influencing policymakers or other decision makers. So it's about contributing to that policy discussion, about making that change. Now, this is from the literature, and the literature also goes, and I'll talk shortly about the different ways and the different tactics that not-for-profits use in negotiating this policy process with governments. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. What is advocacy? It comes under lots of different names. Here's a list. I won't read them all out. You can see them for yourself. But both in the literature and out there in the community, and you'll be aware of this, is that there's lots of different terms for advocacy. And a lot of organisations are very careful about the language that they use. So words like maybe activism and lobbying would not necessarily be common words used out there in the community because they tend to have a negative connotation. What I've found with a lot of the organisations I've been working with is they use words like maybe participation or education or engagement. Okay? They believe that those words are more conducive to the negotiating with governments. Okay. So what does the literature say at the moment? And this is literature I've looked at not only here in Australia but also internationally. Non-profits are advocating. They are still out there in the community making a difference as far as policy discussions are concerned. What they have done is they've identified different strategies. Probably if we look back about 30, 40 years ago, we were a community that more likely to go in and demonstrate publicly, hold rallies, massive public media promotions as well. We don't see that as much nowadays, but that doesn't mean the not-for-profits aren't advocating. They're just finding different ways of doing it. But in conversation with the not-for-profits, and I'd be interested to see what your experience is that they still feel that the government may withdraw funding or make it difficult for them if they are seen to be too vocal and too uncooperative out there in the community. So on one hand, they're realising that they need to negotiate with governments, but on the other hand, they also are aware that they have to be a little bit careful how they do it. The other thing that's coming out in the research is that those organisations that are accessing government funding have been able to develop relationships with governments. And through that relationship, they are able to negotiate and make policy change with the government they're talking with. So on one hand, we have a situation where we want to be careful about how we negotiate a contract and don't upset our funder, but on the other hand, having a funding contract enables them to have a position on the policy table. It was interesting with David, he talked about the number of number of not-for-profits receiving government funding, and it's mainly the large organisations that are accessing the government contracts. And I guess that means that they are the ones that will be sitting at the policy table. Okay. This is again just from the literature. What I have found is that the literature tends to group advocacy tactics and advocacy strategies into particular categories. They find it easier to then look at how these categories will operate out there in the community. So here are some significant writers in the community. From an Australian perspective, we have Onyx down the bottom there, 2010. Jenny has written extensively in this area, particularly looking at some of the communities in New South Wales and on the East Coast, and has identified various categories for the strategies in advocacy. What you will see, there is a general trend across the categories in that there's two main groups. There's ones we talk about, those where not-for-profits are developing relationships with their funders. Administrative tactics, direct strategies, institutional or insider strategies is what they're referring, or categories what they're referring to. And in these particular categories, the not-for-profit will generally have a government contract, are happy to meet with government. If they are unhappy with what government do, they won't publicly demonstrate. They'll have conversations behind the closed door. Alternatively to that is having public, I suppose, remonstrations or demonstrations against government policy to send that message that we're not happy with the policy that's currently being driven. And we refer to those as legislative, indirect, radical categories as far as those tactics are concerned. And I think a lot of the data tends to support these particular categories. One thing that has come out of looking at the literature, both internationally and in Australia, is that there is still a feeling that not-for-profits have to be very careful about biting the hand that feeds them. Okay. So deciding to advocate, there's 4 questions, and this is effectively where I'm sort of ending up today, is there is a risk associated with advocating. So you have to make that decision as a not-for-profit. Do you take that risk or do you not? Who is responsible for making that decision within the organisation? Is it senior management, the CEO? Is it the board? How do the staff feel about that decision that's been made? What advocacy tactics are used in that particular organisation? And some organisations are quite deliberate about their advocacy tactics that they're using. And then there's sometimes tension on the advocacy agenda within the organisation itself when senior staff may be pursuing a particular agenda that may clash with others' agenda within the organisation. So my research is in not-for-profit organisations in Western Australia and asking them how do they engage, or do they engage in advocacy tactics? And if they do, how do they feel about that? Do they believe that they're going to be risking their current or future sources of funding? So I'm presenting the results from 4 case studies and the not-for-profit. Now, as a case study, essentially meant I went in and I interviewed with senior management staff. I reviewed a lot of their literature, their annual reports and their website, and any media that may be associated with that particular organisation. Okay, now the 4 organisations are slightly different, and I picked them deliberately so I could look at some of the issues within those organisations. The first one was very small and received no government funding. They actually only had 1 part-time administrative person, and that just basically looked after the admin for the organisation. It was purely run on volunteers, so the volunteers delivered the services. They had a board of volunteers as well that looked after and effectively managed the whole organisation. They deliberately did not seek out government funding because they wanted to have their own agenda. They wanted to be able to, if required, publicly send messages to the government about policy decisions. So their mission and services were provided by volunteers who also engage in advocacy. So there was a lot of encouragement by the board. Whenever there was an issue in the community, they would approach their volunteers and say, okay, now we want you to do letter writing, or now we're going to have a rally on Parliament House. So they were quite engaging with their volunteers in this particular area. The whole agenda for the organisation, as far as the running of the organisation and their advocacy, was run by the chairman of the board in conjunction with the board. So it was very much one of those smaller organisations with a very limited funding. Okay. The second case study is a medium-sized case study. The income's $3 million, which kind of clashes with the ACNC definition of medium, because their definition of medium was anything between $250,000 and $1 million. But I kind of felt this was medium because of the size of the operation and how they operated. I may have to review that. But it's 100% government funding. They don't pick up any other funds anywhere. Any money they receive alternatively will be incidental, so it might be a minor bequest, but it's very, very small. They do have 30 paid staff and 70 volunteer staff. So they do rely quite heavily on their volunteer staff. And this is one of the distinctions I found I needed to make when I'm talking about medium and large, is their volunteer and their paid staff. The CEO was the principal advocate for the organisation and heavily drove an advocacy agenda. The previous CEO was not wanting to be involved in advocacy at all, and the organisation actually had to take a step back. So when the new CEO came on board, he very much pushed this advocacy agenda. He was very keen to work with media and utilise media a lot, both print and the radio media, as far as pushing a particular agenda. He was also happy to work with the volunteers in the organisation and the membership. there was a particular occasion where there was looking at some legislative changes that was occurring in Perth at the time. And what happened was they actually organised a meeting with the minister and significant people over there, and all the volunteers and the members came in and told their story. And the consequence of that was quite significant, not only for the organisation but also for the government there of the day. And it resulted in some changes being made to the legislation, which was quite productive. So it's an example of advocacy in action. But it was the influence of the volunteers, the members telling their story, and that was a specific agenda by the CEO. But in that organisation, the advocacy is run by the CEO and in conjunction with the chairman, and also engages quite heavily the chairman in this one. One of the questions I asked a lot of these organisations is, how do you use your volunteers? Do you engage them in advocacy? What role do they have? And one of the responses that came out of some of these case studies was that they said, we believe that when our volunteers are doing their job, that is advocacy. And I thought that was slightly different to the definition I was finding in the literature. So that was something interesting that came out of not only this case study, but the next two as well. The third case study was a large organisation which received 80% government funding. It's been around for a long time and deals with, supports children with disabilities, or individuals with disabilities. The CEO is the principal advocate for the organisation and is very, very aware of the importance of advocacy in the community, but is also extremely aware of the need to be careful. He talked about picking your battles and was very careful to identify those causes that were more significant than others, and therefore they are the ones that they would have pursued. The chairman and the board are also engaged heavily in advocacy. So it was the senior staff, the paid staff, in particular, the ones with the skills who would have got involved in this particular agenda. There's minimal involvement of volunteers advocacy for reform in the sector, and this is where I started to notice in the larger organisations they were reluctant, or I don't know if that's the right word, but they did not want to necessarily engage staff or certain staff and volunteers in a specific advocacy agenda. Again, when asked, they sort of said, well, we believe our volunteers, by doing their job, are advocating because they're out there with our brand and people in the community see our brand. So that, to them, was a form of advocacy. Okay, case study 4. This was the largest of the organisation and was only 60% government funded. They had made a specific agenda to diversify their funding portfolio and was continually looking at new ways to develop funding streams, and particularly with social enterprise and those types of selling goods and services, instead of having to rely too much on government funding. This organisation had been around for quite a while and employs over 700 staff and 150 volunteers, so it's actually quite a large organisation. The CEO is a principal advocate for this organisation and obviously the chairman and the board are also engaged in this. But again, the CEO was quite clear that as far as our advocacy agenda was concerned, it was to be driven by the CEO and also by a particular individual in the organisation. They had actually created this new position and one of their strategies was social advocacy, but it was this particular individual position that was going to drive that particular agenda. This organisation had undertaken a significant reform in recent years where they had moved location. They were in a nice new building in a nice area of Perth. All areas of Perth are nice, but this was particularly nice. And so they had really sought to change their brand. They had a very good reputation in the community on the ground. And what they wanted to do was lift that to be not only being highly thought of on the ground, but also as far as a professional organisation was concerned. So this new building was very nice and lots of glass and everything. And they had employed individuals to run their finance and their management. And these individuals were highly trained. Some have even come from government, so they had a lot of experience with things like contracting. They also had the finance to set up particular areas in the organisation that specifically dealt with funding contracts, making tenders and involved in those types of activities. Again, they were reluctant to engage volunteers or their membership in actual advocacy activities. And again, their response was, well, by volunteers being out there in the community, they have our brand, and they are seen to be advocates for us as well. So that seemed to come through quite strongly. But this organisation was quite specific in promoting their brand and making sure that that was protected. And there was concern that they felt that if they went outside and were seen to be difficult, maybe with public advocacy strategies, that could affect their brand and possibly their funding contracts. Okay. So effectively, non-profit organisations are advocating in the sector. They're effectively identifying what they see as appropriate for their organisation, and they're structuring themselves according to that. And it might be their funding structure, there might be their management structure that deals with that as well. Volunteers can be important advocates, and we saw that particularly in the first two case studies, where there was a deliberate activity to involve volunteers in these particular agendas. Again, the other issue that came out for me, which I thought was interesting, how there was a perception in most of the organisations that by having volunteers doing their job and wearing their brand, they were effectively advocates for the organisation. All organisations believe advocacy is extremely important as far as a not-for-profit is concerned. They realise that their prime role is delivery of goods and services, but advocacy is also very, very important. So it's about community involvement to spread the mission. Obviously, there are limitations as far as staffing and resources are concerned. Some of the organisations also identified skills. So they're looking to use people with certain skills to get involved in these particular activities. I've put limitation of findings down the bottom. That was just an academic thing. We always do, limitation of findings. But I've been looking at what's happening in WA, and a lot of why I started looking at it is because I saw what Genionics had done in New South Wales, and I thought, gee, that's interesting. Does that happen in WA? We are a little bit different over there, only a little bit, and maybe we do things a little bit differently. I'm not sure that we do. I think not-for-profits are highly intelligent organisations that develop strategies that will suit what they are in effect doing. Okay. So the decision to advocate. So not-for-profits acknowledge that there are risks associated with advocating, including loss of funds and public support. So that issue of branding has become particularly important, especially for the larger organisations. And so at times they say, look, we're actually not going to advocate. We're going to step back from this issue because we know there are other more important issues to deal with, or we're going to try a different advocacy strategy. And a lot of them talked about this issue of education. So rather than saying we're advocating, we're lobbying, we're just educating the community. And that is another way to advocate. Responsibility decision to advocate generally rests with the board or the CEO of these organisations, and again, it's about picking your fights, which one is worth fighting for. There is also a general feeling, I don't know if it's on the East Coast, but in the West side, that as far as tenders and trying to obtain government contracts, it's very competitive, and they're very cautious in how they negotiate some of these paths. So non-profits choose advocacy tactics appropriate for their organisation and their agenda. In some organisations, there is tension. So you're going to have individuals within the organisation say, we think we should have this advocacy strategy, and others think we should have this advocacy strategy. And it is interesting how they negotiate that path. I generally think it's the person at the top is possibly winning at the moment, but that's something that they would have to be aware of. But there is definitely tension according to those policy decisions made within non-profit organisations. Okay. What I've come up with from my research, and I'd welcome any feedback on this when we conclude, is a bit of a model as far as technical positions for advocacy are concerned, and how not-for-profits engage in these particular processes. So the model identifies that at the top we have cooperative, which is where organisations want to be seen to be cooperating with their funders, in particular government. So they will engage with them in meetings, they look at building relationships with the policymakers. So they're not necessarily going to upset anyone. So being a cooperative, we might give you a report, we might give you some figures, we'll meet with you in meetings, we'll give you some policy advice, but it will all be quite consensual. On the other hand, we have confrontational. This is more, I suppose, conflict, and this is where the not-for-profit will stand up and go, actually, we're not really happy with this particular decision or this policy or this legislation. We want to change it. And sometimes they might do that behind closed doors, and they can get a bit cranky, but it's behind a closed door. Alternatively, they'll become quite open and public about their displeasure with a particular policy. So it'll be about rallies, demonstrations, writing letters to the media as well, engaging with them. So you kind of have that two levels of tactics. And then I look at the issue of being whether you're inside or outside the space. And inside that space means that you've probably got a government contract and you're nurturing the relationship with the policymaker, which is usually the government. So when you're talking about confrontational tactics and you're an insider, you'll do it behind closed doors. You'll still tell them that you're not happy, but you'll be very, very careful about how you do that. Alternatively, if you're on the outside, you probably don't have a government contract and you're more likely to be vocal and public with your opinions. So they're the groups that will tend to do rallies and demonstrations, and as I say, they usually don't have access to the government funds, and they probably are smaller as well. Okay, so that's a little model that I have effectively developed. What I have found, not only looking at the literature and obviously with the research I've done in WA, is that not all not-for-profits engage in some form of systemic advocacy. Whilst they might realise there's an important role to be played, they may not have the resources or the skills. But a lot of them do. A lot of them believe that it's part of their role as a not-for-profit in delivering their services in that way. So it becomes important. What my research has identified is that not-for-profits are advocating, but they're using different ways to advocate depending on their resources. And they are very aware that their volunteers are an important resource for them. And for some of these organisations, they're deliberately using the volunteers' skills in advocating on behalf of the organisations. Alternatively, they identify that for volunteers, by doing their job, are in fact advocating on behalf of their organisation. Interesting enough, government contracts can in fact, whilst creating a dilemma, can in fact create opportunities for advocacy because you're nurturing this particular relationship with the funders. And that's a positive for some organisations that they are very careful to protect as far as that relationship is concerned. And I guess effectively, whilst there is limited funding available, organisations need to identify the best way of dealing with this particular dilemma.